welcome again to this ADAS webinar this morning. So we're going to cover today the role of folpet in fungicide programs. And we have with us Rebecca Joynt from ADAS. So welcome and thank you, Rebecca, for presenting the summary of the report you've created. We also have on the call this morning Andrew Bailey from ADAMA, who is one of our fungicide technical specialists. And we have Jason Tatnall from Syngenta, also a fungicide technical specialist for Syngenta. So Rebecca's going to run through the slides, probably take around 20 to 25 minutes of presentation, and then we've got time at the end of the webinar for questions. So feel free to pop those questions in the chat as we go along. And then at the end, I'll run through any of the questions that we have. Either I can read them out from the chat, or if you'd like to turn off your mute and ask the question live, then that's absolutely fine too. Either way is fine by us. So I don't think there's anything else that I need to tell you housekeeping wise. I've mentioned about the fact that the webinar is being recorded. So we'll just kick straight off with Rebecca, if that's okay.
So yeah, hi everybody. As Mel said, I work at ADAS, research scientist in crop protection, and I've been managing the cereal fungicide work for ADAMA and Syngenta now for the past few years. The piece of work I'm going to talk to you about today is a review that I've completed this winter for both companies together, looking at the role of folpet in programmes. So over the last 3 years, 2019 to 2021, in trials commissioned by ADAMA and Syngenta. So I won't dwell on this first slide. It's something that I'm sure we all know, but FRAC recommends that multi-sites should be included in programs for reduction in rate of development to resistance to fungicides when used as mixture partners. So that's particularly important for new chemistry coming to market. But actually, multi-site fungicides also provide additional disease control. And as I'm going to show in the next few minutes, this results in yield output, which ultimately, with rising costs, is what everybody is having to justify their inputs now with clear yield margins. So the key questions that have been being sort of asked of ADAS around the use of folpet in programs sort of build down to sort of 4 topics. So rate, so full rate, total dose being 3 litres per hectare, but in terms of a single application, whether you go for 1 litre or 1.5 litres. And in terms of that single application, then timing becomes a question, so T1 or T2. And then building on from that, actually, do you see a benefit from multiple applications within a programme? And then also around the question of does programme strength affect the benefit of folpet? So is there still a benefit to including folpet in those higher input, stronger programmes? So a summary of the data. So we looked at 15 trials over that 3-year period. And actually across those 15 trials, so that we looked at 55 individual situations where folpet was added to the base program. So perhaps where that was a base program of Asca at T1 followed by Revostar at T2, where we then had the same treatment in that trial with an Asca plus Arizona T1 followed by Revostar T2, we could then quantify the yield benefit that that T1 was adding, whether it was significant or just the trends. So in terms of the breakdown of those 55 situations, there was 15 situations in 2019, 14 in 2020, and actually the majority were in 2021, 26 situations. So the majority of these trials, although not all of them, were based in the west of the UK. So quite a few were in Herefordshire, located around ADAS Rosemond, and they were predominantly susceptible varieties to septoria, although not always. There were a few instances where we were looking at varietal impact that we included in this trial. So the table at the bottom shows the division of those 55 situations across the different timings and rates. So you can see that we had 10 T1, 10 T2, and actually the majority then were 2 application situations that we were looking at, and a small number where we were looking at a 3-way split. So if we look at the overall yield responses we were seeing, so if we ignore the different colour classifications just for the time being, the overall benefit we were seeing across all 55 situations was 0.31 tonnes per hectare. That ranged from a minus 0.7 down here, right up to around 1.1 tonnes per hectare. And actually, of these small number that were seeming to show negative yield responses, 8 of those were not significant, so probably just noise within a trial. So looking at the higher end, just one of those points I mentioned a minute ago about variety, actually this bar here was Costello in Herefordshire in 2021, which was giving around a tonne yield response. So yeah, not always just susceptible varieties. So overall, 78% of the situations we looked at gave a positive yield response. When we begin to break that down to look at the questions I showed earlier, in terms of number of applications, so one application here, whether it was T1 or T2, we were seeing an average of around 0.16 tonnes per hectare yield response from a 1 litre application, and a litre and a half was giving around a 0.27. We did see an increase for 2 applications and a small increase again for 3 applications. And actually, of those 2 application programs giving around 0.4 yield response for a litre application twice, 54% of those gave a statistically significant yield response over the base program. So one thing just to just sort of point out, I suppose, is that we can't always directly compare. They're not necessarily the same subset of trials that all of these were tested in. So we couldn't put any stats overall to the differences. So it is trends that we're looking at, but hopefully they're still useful given the number of situations we're looking at here. So to look at that graphically, which is a bit more visual, in terms of number of applications here, the green is a 2 application program and the yellow is the 3 application program. So you can see that although, again, there is the spread, we have got some green applications on the left-hand side here, the vast majority of the 2 applications programs are sitting on the right-hand side, showing larger yield benefits above sort of 0.2 upwards tonnes per hectare. In terms of the application timing, breaking it down a little bit more now with these T1 and T2 applications. So when we look at T1, so there was 6 situations where we looked at a 1 litre application in T1, and they gave an average yield benefit of 0.4 tonnes per hectare. And the 4 situations where we looked at a litre and a half gave an average response of 0.27. So there is a bit of an anomaly here, and I think it's worth just pointing out that I think the T2 value has been disproportionately skewed, probably by a seasonal effect. There's 10 situations where we looked at the T2 value, and of those 10, 9 of them were in 2021. So just to recap on last season, particularly in Herefordshire with us, we saw the peak of the epidemic in sort of early to mid-July. So that was around 4 to 6 weeks after the T2 applications. And so relative to the application timing, with folpet being contact protectant, I think the timing of the onset of the epidemic has influenced this value. We might see a different value when we start including more seasons worth of data in this. So if we look then at that single 1 tonne per hectare, 1 litre per hectare application, so whether the T2 bars in blue here and the T1 bars in blue and the T2 bars in yellow, actually, if you exclude either end, so outliers in the situation, there is no clear separation in the majority of those trials. So moving on to look at rate. So again, we didn't very often test a litre or a litre and a half in the same trial. It was normally one or another. So, but there is some overlap, and we can look at the trends here. So in the T1 applications, we weren't seeing a clear benefit to increasing the rate to a litre and a half. And when we look there at the T1 and the T2, again, I think this is worth pointing out that there's a seasonal effect, I think, taking a role in the fact that we're not seeing the yield response here. So of the T1 and the T2 applications, there was 31 situations where we applied folpet twice over the base programme. So there was 18 at a litre and a half and 13 at a litre. Of those, 11 of the 18 where we applied a litre and a half were applied in 2020. So I'm sure, again, just to recap on the weather, 2020 was very hot and dry right through May and June. So we didn't see very much septoria, and the disease pressure didn't seem to build very much through the season. So we did see limited fungicide responses, and in some cases, actually, we weren't even seeing a significant response to fungicides over the untreated. So if you exclude those 11 situations here at the litre and a half, and just look at the 7 situations from 2019 and 2021, we see a yield response there of 0.64 over the base programme. So that would be around over a 0.2 yield response from increasing the rate of folpet at those applications from a litre to a litre and a half. So yeah, just to sort of point out that there are some caveats in the data. It is only based on a 3-year data set, so hopefully this can be built on in future years. And obviously the season has a key impact on the role of folpet. So if you look then, breaking it down, so the here, as we were saying, so a T1 or a T2 application, again, predominantly to the left, sort of middle chunk of this part, with the 2 applications sitting to the right-hand side. The T2, looking at those values, again, as we've just said, I think is skewed probably by these 2 very large values here, which were both recorded in 2021. So the final factor we looked at was the strength of the base programme. So we divided the situations, the base programmes, arbitrary really, into strong and weak classifications. So we classified a strong programme as a T2 application of any new chemistry in trial, or Revstar above a half label rate, so above 0.75 litres per hectare. And this gave 20 strong programmes and 35 weak programmes across the 3 years. So the subset or subdivision of those, just sort of to make the data fully clear. For the strong programmes, again, we had a majority sitting in the T1 and the T2 bracket. Sorry, that should say 1 there, that's a typo. Again, for the week programmes, majority were looking at the 2 application timings. So in terms of the yield responses we were seeing, when you split it by the strong and weak programmes, we were seeing similar trends in both programmes. The T1 1 litre per hectare applications giving higher yield responses than the T2, and with the 2 application programmes of a litre yielding higher than the single application at T1. So for both, that was the same for both programmes, although in the week programmes we were tending to see around a 0.1 additional benefit over an equivalent application in the strong programme. The largest yield benefits we saw in the trial came from the 3 situations where we tested a 3-way split in the week programmes, and these gave a 0.64 tonnes per hectare benefit. So in terms of being sort of statistically significant of the trials here, the subset of the T1 and the T2 litre application twice, in the week programmes, 83% of those situations were statistically significant, giving a yield response over the base programme. So in terms of rate, as we've just shown, there's no clear evidence of a dose response with the 2 application programme in either strength-based programme, so the strong or the weak, but obviously with the caveats we've already discussed. And the timing of the single application, again, with the caveats we've already discussed, the T1 application giving a greater benefit apparent in this data set than the T2 application. So looking at the data there for a single application, you can see here that there is a small number of trials that were giving or appearing to give no yield response. So these were predominantly T2 applications in strong programmes. And again, as I've already said, I think these were influenced by the 2021 season. And again, we're seeing the bars here, so the orange being a T1 week programme and the blue being a T2 week programme. We're seeing them typically giving similar yield responses, with the weak programmes tending to give more benefit than the stronger programmes. In terms of number of applications in the strong or the weak programme, so for both situations, the 2 applications of a litre, so a T1 and a T2, gave greater yield responses than a single litre application at T1 in both. So over the base programme, we were seeing 2 applications of folpet in a week programme giving a 0.5 tonne per hectare yield response, and that was 0.05 benefit compared to a single application. So that's in the green here and in the blue. So the strong programmes, these were giving on average a 0.37 tonne per hectare response over the base programme, and that was an additional 0.02 tonnes per hectare over a single application for applying twice. 3 applications gave even greater responses, so we were seeing an average of 0.46, but this was quite a small data set. But in the 3 week programmes, we were seeing an average of 0.64 tonnes per hectare yield response. So in some situations, there is a benefit to going with a 3-way split over the 2-way split. Finally, I was going to look at sort of economic margins on this. So difficult to put value on this, and when I completed this review back in January, we used a week price of £250 per ton, which in today's prices seems quite low. So, however, using £7.50 a litre for folpet, with that price, the yield response you're needing to see for each litre of folpet application is 0.03 tonnes per hectare. And that is only going to go down as the price of wheat increases. So very small margins you're needing to see in terms of getting your money back. And actually in this data set, 75% of the situations, whether it was a single application or 2 applications or 3 applications even, gave a return on input cost. So it really, in the vast majority, you are seeing your money back from an application of folpet. When you split that down, so the top here is showing your yield responses. So the green boxes are showing where we've got above that 0.03 for a single application. Obviously that increases here to 0.06 or 0.09 for a total dose of 3 litres per hectare. But we are seeing margins over input cost per hectare for these situations. And actually, when you put the figures to it, they are quite reasonable margins. So a single application at T1, you're seeing a margin of sort of £90 per hectare, which obviously adds up. And you split it down by base programme. So in the strong programmes, we were seeing a benefit from a litre either applied at T1 or 2 applications. But actually in weak programmes, we saw a benefit of folpet application at all input timings and rates. Yeah, so in wheat programmes, all the inputs gave an economic return, with the 1 litre per hectare applied twice, giving a return of £110 per hectare. And in strong programmes, this was typically smaller margins we were seeing, but they were still there and they were still reasonable in size. So nearly £80 a hectare for that litre application. So just to conclude, we were consistently seeing in the data in this review a yield response from the inclusion of folpet in programmes, and we typically saw larger yield responses from the T1 and T2 applications than a single application. Although with the caveats we've talked about with the T2 timing, the data appears to show that a T1 timing gives a greater benefit from the protectant activity of folpet. The evidence to increase rate, I think, has been compromised by seasonal variation, but there's a clear trend in the data here that 1 litre is definitely enough to see reasonable margins across your inputs, and particularly shown in the wheat programmes. So in all equivalent applications, you're seeing a greater benefit in the weaker programmes, although the strong programmes were still giving good yield responses and margins over input cost. I think there might be a couple of questions.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Rebecca. There's lots of really interesting and in-depth information in that report. So I think that's very useful. Thank you. I do have, so I've got one question so far from Bernard Martin, specifically asking about the weak versus the strong programme. So how weak was the weak programme versus the strong programme?
Yeah, so it ranged a bit. So the weak programme could be anything from an AMA twice or a Proline twice, up to I bracketed anything that had more than a half rate of Rebestar at T2 as a strong programme. So you could have some programme that I classed as weak that had a full rate of ASCA at T2, But yeah, I drew, class anything that was a strong program had Revistar or new chemistry at T2. And there was quite a range in the scale of weak programs. I looked at trying to divide it a little bit further and going as far as a weak, a medium, and a strong, but that got, that was going down a rabbit hole that was never going to end.
Brilliant. Okay. Right. Any other questions from anyone else? So we've got Rebecca on the call, but we've also got Andy Bailey and Jason Tatler as well. If you've got anything you'd like to ask those two guys. You've obviously done a very fantastic job of explaining everything well, Rebecca.
Either that or it's data overload.
Possibly at this time in the morning.
It was one of those that, there was, the more you started looking, the further you could go.
Yeah, I'm sure you could continue to slice it and dice it in so many ways. Okay, so I've got a question on barley here, spring barley. Any comments on the use of folpet and Ramilaria? Andy, I don't know if you want to take this one, or Rebecca, if you've got thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, morning everybody. I can say something. So Andy Bailey. I think first of all, let's be clear. This is caveated by the fact that that Ramilaria isn't on the folpet label, but of course we do know it's got activity. And we are looking to get that actually approved on label. But folpet, sorry, this is Rinco, isn't it? Oh no, sorry, Ramilaria. Now I'm getting myself confused. Yeah, so Ramilaria, we've certainly got activity, and I would say, the key timing of paintbrush. Our recommendations are to include it with partners at 1 to 1.5 litres per hectare. It clearly provides protection, and certainly, from an efficacy point of view, but also a resistance management point of view. We are further looking at a programmed approach, because we've seen a 2-spray inclusion offer improved results, particularly in trials in Ireland, in spring barley, and so we're continuing to work on that and refine it. Doesn't happen every year, but Ramilaria is a challenging pathogen, and it's very dependent season to season how it behaves and expresses itself. But certainly, including it, and the key timing being including with partners at T2.
Great, thanks, Andy. So we've got a question here about rust. Is rust seen as an additional benefit in programs?
Is that another one for me, I guess? So in terms of folpet's rust activity, I always say it's very much a side effect. It can have some suppressive activity on yellow rust if it's in there in a purely protectant situation, but you're talking about a 25 to 30% reduction at best. So it's quite low. But one thing I would say about folpet, it does not interfere with the uptake of the curative partner product. So in a rust situation, you don't want antagonism. Folpet doesn't do that, so you can add it without concerns. On brown rust, we know from many trials in Europe and also in the UK that it's got a little bit more intrinsic activity against brown rust. So if you're including folpet at a T2 timing in a brown rust susceptible variety, then it can give up to 50% suppression of brown rust. So it contributes much more to brown rust than yellow rust.
Thanks, Andy. I've got a few questions coming in now, so I'm going to put this one to Rebecca if I can. Have you got any comments around using folpet as an anti-resistance strategy in wheat to protect other chemistry in the programme?
Yeah, so the key benefit of multi-sites in a programme is the anti-resistance sort of strategy approach. Yeah, the yield benefits that we're seeing and I've been talking about are probably sort of a side benefit, particularly where new chemistry is in programmes. The guidance is that including a multi-site in a programme will slow the rate of the development of resistance to that mixture partner, so the new chemistry.
Thanks, Rebecca. I don't know if Andy or Jason wanted to add anything to that, or...
Yeah, I can just add, apologies for the croak, I've got a bit of sore throat this morning. No, I totally agree. And I was just thinking that you've divided your programs there by weak and strong. Well, of course, today's strong program is unfortunately tomorrow's weak program. And the fact that you see that increased benefit from folpet in the weak programs, that's demonstrating an efficacy contribution this over those years. You know, the resistance management contribution is moving from, you know, that kind of rescue benefit, efficacy benefit, to stopping that decline. And I think that's the harder part to get across. There's two benefits. There's the efficacy benefit in season, but the resistance management benefit comes over time. It's stopping those strong treatments declining to becoming weak treatments. You know, it's slowing that process down.
Yeah, that was a nice way of putting it, Jason.
Great, thank you. Okay, one back to Andy, I think. Any comment around dose rate reduction for water volume or changes coming to the label?
Yes, we have our CRD are in the process of issuing new authorizations. Historically, with the what I'd call the old label, we had a qualified use on it of 100 litres per hectare water volume. Of course, with the caveat that that wasn't supported by efficacy or crop safety data, but that was on the label. That was removed through a review, but we applied to have a reduced water volume reinstated, you know, for practical reasons. And the new authorization will have 150 litres per hectare on it as a qualified use. That effectively means also it'll have a comment when the new labels come out, but it's in the authorization, or the equivalent of a 1% volume for volume dilution. So that effectively means that, for example, you know, you could go with a litre of Arizona in 100 litres of water. One thing I would say is, of course, that you could take that a step further, and if you go below recommended folpet rates, which you know, I think I've always been clear are 1 to 1.5 litres of product per hectare. It does mean that you could reduce water volumes further. I often get asked about 75 or 80 litres per hectare. I think we really have to remember that folpet is a contact protectant product, and therefore, you know, we need good coverage, and you will be eroding the potential of the product if we cut water volumes too low. So that's always a kind of an advice piece. I think be careful. This new authorization will give you that flexibility to you know, to use a reduced rate, but I think you know, you need to be sensible and use the correct water volume compared to the timing of the crop, etc., to achieve good coverage.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, question again for Rebecca. Did the margin over cost just include fungicide cost, or also the application cost?
Yeah, so in this, it was just the fungicide cost on the basis that we were looking at the benefit over a base program. So if you're already going through with your fungicide and it was only a case of adding the folpet to the tank, there wasn't any additional application costs over what you were already incurring.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Okay, I think that's everything in the list. Anyone else got any final questions before we wrap things up? Question, was there no T0 application in trials?
So there was a few situations where we looked at the a three-way split, so a T0, a T1 and a T2 of folpet. And yeah, we did see good yield benefits from those. I don't know if I can skip that. Yes, so the yellow bars there were the three-way split. In some of the other trials, in some cases there was a T0, but that was the same for both plus and minus folpet. It was included as part of the base program, so wouldn't have had any influence on the data. The yellow bars there are where folpet was included as an extra addition at T0.
Great, thank you. Any final questions? If you, of course, if you sort of have a think about this later on and come up with a question, then you're always welcome to send that directly to your contact at either ADAMA or Syngenta, and I'm sure we can get that answered for you. We will also be putting a version of this report on our website for people to take a look at a later date if you wanted to go and have a look through some of the points again. So feel free to go and have a look at either the ADAMA or the Syngenta websites, and I'm sure you can find further information on folpet in those places. And as I say, we are recording this website for those people or colleagues perhaps that couldn't join us today, so we'll make sure that we send on email a link to the recording that you can forward on for anyone that wants to have a listen that wasn't able to attend. So I think if there's no final questions, then we're about 5 minutes ahead of time. So I'll say thank you very much again to Rebecca for presenting those that report to us. Thanks for Andy and Jason for joining as well. And that's all for today. Thanks. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.